I take it to Robert Lee, I'll show it. I hope and pray he don't blow it hard.
What really made Roxy stand out musically at the beginning was the fact that they were engaging this relentless pursuit of the non-obvious.
Take me on a roller coaster. Take me for an airplane ride.
Immediately they looked different. I'm sure that that was a contrived thing. I think that the intention was to shock.
They were a bit like sort of glam rock but with brains.
Roxy music made weird music that you could sing along to.
Down to me.
For many long-term Roxy music fans, there was something of an epiphany on the 24th of August 1972 when Roxy Music first appeared on the BBC's flagship TV show, Top of the Pops. I get tremendous feedback from people who say that the world really changed for them musically on that day. Roxy's appearance was so very different from so many of the other bands that were around at the time. They were visually striking. They had this single, Virginia Plain.
Throw me a line, I'm sinking, but clutching its jaws can't make it. Haven't the sound to trying, hard as the hips to jiving.
Virginia Plain arrived really at a time when the world was kind of saturated with this prog rock nonsense and this kind of American West Coast droning, hippie droning, and Roxy music just came from nowhere.
I remember hearing it for the first time on the radio, and it was just so unlike everything else that was around at the time, and you just went, what is that? You know, it was incredible. And I can remember it being played down the youth club disco and all of that stuff, and it was just because it's a really energetic up song, but it's strange, you know, and it's still a strange song actually. The way it's put together is very odd indeed.
And what's really musically interesting about it is it's a very simple 4-chord trick. But what's even more interesting about it is it's 4 major chords, which is quite unusual. It starts with F sharp major, and then it goes to C sharp major, then it goes to B major, then the stop is on A flat major, back up to C sharp major. And that's the whole sequence. At the time that it came out, there was a lot of bands playing sort of blues and sort of more progressive rock, and this was really simplified and to a certain extent, a sort of pre-runner of punk in a sense, like keep it as simple as possible. Although it was a sort of red herring from them because they were actually quite a musical band. And that's essentially the whole of the song, round and round, with a little solo section in the middle, which uses 2 of the chords, 2 of the 4 chords, where it goes. And that's the whole song.
It has the usual Ferry stream of consciousness lyric, and it's almost a shopping list song of Ferry's likes and dislikes. He always drops in these cultural references, art references, all the things he likes. He even finds time to name drop his own lawyer in the song's lyric.
And they had an amazing way of grabbing you, actually, Roxy music, particularly with their singles. They had an amazing way of doing a perfect intro that would sound amazing on the radio and just jump out at you and made you want to kind of just immerse yourself in their world.
Virginia Plain.
Roxy Music had in fact released their album some months before, and Brian Ferry had this almost Beatlesque idea that singles and albums should be separate things, and that and for that reason Virginia Plain didn't actually appear on the first album until later on, really later versions. So Virginia Plain was intended really, I think, as a statement of intent for Roxy.
It's like the sound of the future mixed with, I don't know, the sound of the past, and with Brian Ferry, the coolest man you've ever seen walking across the stage. He's like a cross between Lou Reed and Noel Coward, you know. He was just a cool guy, and that just sort of announced them to the world. And I think the world kind of sat up and went, what the hell is that? And what planet have they come from?
We've been around a long time. Just try to make the big time. Take me on a roller coaster. Take me for an airplane ride. Take me for a 61 love, but don't you throw my pride side to side. What's real and make believe? Baby jeans in Acapulco, we are flying down to Rio.
The thing about Brian Ferry's voice is it's immediately identifiable, which of course all the great bands have really. He has a style very much of his own. He developed a style very much of his own. Don't know if that just developed through playing with the other guys in Roxy Music, or he had an idea in his head how he was going to sound. But I think one of the things that's quite interesting about the way he sings is it tends to be half spoken, half singing. And his diction is very good, and I think it's obviously important for him to get his lyrics across.
Take a sweet girl just like you. How nice if only we could be like.
You listen to the early Roxy Music stuff when they first came out. It was so mannered. I mean, it was so put on in a way. I mean, which was, I think, all part of the plan at the time, was to do stuff that was really just weird, you know, just that was really going to get noticed. And it was such a mannered way of singing, which has kind of influenced all sorts of people. But as you listen to the music as it develops over the years, of course, there's less and less of the all that sort of stuff.
Ferry was very good, I think, at writing lyrics that suited his voice as well. And the songs that he wrote tended to have moments of theatricality within them as well. So perhaps that suited that particular vocal style that he had developed. There were key changes and time changes within many of the Roxy songs, which meant that you could build up moments of drama and theatre within the songs.
And as a singer, he just kind of synthesized all of this into one kind of ball of cool. You know, I don't think there's anyone like Brian Ferry before him or after him. And the interesting thing about him as a singer, you can hear his influences. You can kind of almost pinpoint them, but you can never actually say he sounds like anyone. He's always been greater than the sum of his individual influences, which is really rare for a rock and roll singer.
I think there were influences certainly from 50s and 60s R&B and rock and roll, as though with every band of that time. And again, I think those influences become clearer later. I think in the early days, they were deliberately, I think, sort of using some of those influences, but in unusual ways and kind of disguising them. So it wasn't at all obvious that those influences were necessarily there. They applied a sort of lot of lateral thinking to what they were doing, I think.
Got me all around town. You've got me, girl, on the run around. And it's getting me down, getting me down. Lady, if you want to find a lover, then you're looking no further. For I'm gonna be your only.
Ladytron is something of a blueprint for many of those early Roxy Music songs, in that it builds in those moments of theatricality, those moments of light and dark that make Roxy's songs so very interesting. It has that wonderful opening with these kind of ethereal keyboards built up by Brian Eno and Andy Mackay playing this very un-rock and roll instrument, the oboe. Very unusual for the oboe to appear, as you can imagine, in any rock and roll context.
One thing that Roxy would tend to do was take two musical sections and marry them in different ways. And in Ladytron, what they have tended to do is they've taken a half-tempo feel and then gone to a double-tempo feel. So you get a tempo change within the song, which is a typical thing that Roxy Music could do, because one of the things about Roxy Music was that because they saw themselves as a rock band and not a pop band, they were able to take musical risks.
It's kind of got this liquid groove, and it's got these sort of weird spatial interludes from Eno, who was kind of given free rein to just go wild on his strange synthesizers and sound boxes and God knows whatever he was up to. Ladytron really, it almost invented avant-garde dance music.
As a technical player, Eno was probably quite limited, but what he was a brilliant conceptualist. He had the ability, I think, to innately understand what sounds Roxy were looking to produce, and he was prepared to be an innovator and to take chances, I think, tremendous chances.
Funnily enough, when I first heard it, I wasn't so sure. I thought, you know, he looks a bit strange, and he's some extremely unusual musical things going on here that are not musically correct. In hindsight, I have to say that he was really sort of forward-thinking and was actually creating what is now called sound design, sort of movie scores within pop songs. So he brought to them all these different ideas using tape loops and different sounds and playing stuff using synthesizers which were very new at that time and creating all sorts of odd sounds you'd never heard before.
I've heard Brian Ferry say that he could take an abstract concept to Eno. He could say, can you make this sound like the moon? Or can you make this sound like night? And Eno had that innate ability to transfer that into a musical sound.
That's what made Roxy music so fascinating, was that kind of juxtaposition between Brian Ferry's, you know, melodic sense and Brian Eno's sense of the absurd.
I tried, but I could not find a way. Looking back, all I did was look away. Next time is the best time, we all know. But if there is no next time, where to go?
Remake, Remodel is a wonderful opening to that first album. It's something of a statement of intent, I think, for Roxy. It starts off with this wonderful, low kind of chatter, cocktail party chatter, if you like, the chinking of glasses in the background.
And then it kind of slides into this sort of gorgeous piano riff, which just leads you into Brian Ferry, who kind of does one of his most boisterous vocals of his career.
When I listen to it, it just seems like it's their take on the whole New York Velvet Underground scene that was happening about sort of 5 or 6 years before they appeared on the scene. Now, whether any of them had travelled to New York and they just picked up that whole feeling from that sort of scene, I don't know. The Andy Warhol, Velvet Underground, you know, the art scene, which of course is definitely interested them.
It's a rocker. I mean, the Remake, Remodel, that's one of the songs that we'll often start the Roxy shows with now. And it's just an obviously great song to start a show with because it's full on from the off. And it's pure energy. It's got the chanty chorus that everyone can join in with, which again sort of has its own slightly strange thing because rather it being sort of woolly bully or something like that, it's a car number plate. But that's okay, CBL 593H. But it works as a chant nonetheless.
Yeah, 593H.
I think it was a very daring and audacious first album. There were no two songs that really necessarily seem to fit together, and yet somehow, as a whole, it seemed to work.
Next time is the best time, we all know. But if there is no next time, we're
It would be hard to imagine Roxy music having happened in any other country. In as much as it was part of any sort of tradition, it was in the tradition of British art school type people forming rock bands.
Art school rock is generally a euphemism for pretentious bollocks. Roxy music may have been pretentious, but they certainly weren't bollocks. You know, they were a cool band.
It was weird and it was different, and it was rock, but it was different rock. And it was something that the only other thing I could equate it to was perhaps Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, but not completely. So they weren't just a copy of that, they had their own thing happening as well, but they had a little tip of the hat to some of that style.
When Roxy first appeared on the scene, some of their limitations were apparent, certainly on that first album. Roxy had not gone the traditional route of spending years banging up and down the M1 in a rusty old transit van, playing thousands of gigs and living on greasy breakfasts. They had appeared, it was almost as if they were a concept, and they appeared fully formed on the scene. So of course they then had to pay their dues, if you like, and go out and play many gigs in order to build up their abilities as a band. Do the Strand is one of Roxy's real high points. It's been a staple of the live act throughout Brian Ferry's career, both his solo career and also with Roxy, because it's such a strong song. Again, it's that shopping list lyric that tends to draw you in, this almost stream of consciousness stuff that he produces.
A danceable solution.
Did they squeeze all of those ideas into 4 minutes on Do the Strand? I mean, that is one of Roxy music's most exciting tracks.
It's got lots of modulations in it. It's also got that weird sort of thing that Supertramp uses a lot, which is quavers, dun, 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 dun. And as I say, it changes key quite a lot. And it's a circular song as well. It keeps going back to the same point, you know. And it's quite interesting. Do the Strand. I mean, what's that about? It's, you know, maybe that's the reason it was so popular, because it was very quirky as well.
It's got its own dance. I mean, that's what it is. So, you know, this has always been a winning formula. I'm not sure it's a widely danced dance, but there is a dance which Brian does, where, you know, when we play the song.
I mean, do the Strand.
There's something strangely familiar about the title and about the structure of the song. Although it's new, it's also got that special quality that you feel as if you've heard that somewhere before. And of course, it's very, very up-tempo.
It's just one of the things that everybody expects to hear, and it's just always good fun to, you know, usually finish off a set with that song.
I think it was something of a missed opportunity, really, in that it was never released as a single in the United Kingdom. And as the opening track on For Your Pleasure, I think probably the record company missed a trick there, because I'm sure that it would have charted very high and would perhaps have promoted Roxy's career even more.
Cheap thrills, boy, word with the begin. The sambas and Josie, they're playing our tune by the pale moon.
When I think of Roxy music, I do think of Brian Eno's weirdness and Brian Ferry's coolness. I don't really think of the drummer or the sax player or the guitar player.
Although Brian Ferry had written and composed the songs and obviously played keyboards as well, he had that clear role as frontman as well. Whilst Brian Eno, who was a brilliant conceptualist in building the sound, the actual practicality of his keyboard playing was not necessarily as good. So I think that Andy Mackay firstly had to do a lot of the workhorse role within the band. Secondly, he provided a tremendous amount of variety in the sound because of his oboe, as we've mentioned before, and of course his tremendous sax playing. He had a wonderful range of sax playing, from alto right through to playing a honking sax in the style of King Curtis.
Lost forever, but it can't beat Strand power. The Sphinx and Mona Lisa, Lolita and Ganica, did the Strand.
It allowed them to have that bit of that sexy soul sax in places, and then occasionally to have the sort of, what I always think that the oboe is a really sort of sad instrument and very useful when you want to get a particular type of atmosphere and a sort of mellow sounding thing.
Yeah, whoever heard of bringing an oboe to a rock band? That's ridiculous, but he did that. His own saxophone playing is very distinctive because he's not coming to it from a sort of jazz background, which an awful lot of saxophone players do. He's definitely a rock and roller in that sense, but again there's a slightly offside sort of sensibility that he brings to his saxophone playing, so that it doesn't just play the obvious rock and roll licks, except sometimes, and then in a particular context, so that it's sort of almost ironic.
He just brought a sort of air of smooth sophistication to Roxy music, whereas I think the others were kind of quite keen on rocking out.
Andy also offered a lot in terms of the visual appeal of the band. He was a very striking looking chap. He had this tendency to have green hair or red hair or orange hair, any colour hair according to the day of the week, and he also had very, very striking stage outfits. And with Ferry kind of pinned to the keyboard at one side of the stage and Eno on the other side, a lot of the visual appeal and the actual movement on stage was provided by Andy.
From another world. They certainly sounded like they looked.
Because most bands at that time were all sort of unshaven and hair everywhere and sort of dirty jeans, and suddenly these people were sort of perfect, but from another planet.
The fashion, I mean, well, you can tell it was definitely the 70s when you look at those pictures from back then, and it was really a lot about being extreme and not wearing denim and flares and all the stuff, that the standard hippie gear that pretty much everyone was wearing. And so, yeah, there's Brian in leopard skin and stuff, which was so sort of 1940s and sort of another era, but it was also very rock and roll because he had the quiff and the pointy, shoes and all that stuff. And then Andy and Phil basically always looking like from outer space, and then Brian Eno looking like more or less a transvestite. Again, all of this stuff has been done to death since, but at the time it just hadn't been done, or barely, or not for very many years. So it was very fresh, certainly to my generation.
Roxy were one of those bands who understood that wherever they appeared, they needed to be striking in their look, striking in their music, and I think that their live show is very much like that as well, even to this day.
Slide on, rainbow, it furs off.
Live, I think they were, much harder than you would imagine, having listened to the records, or if that was your only reference point for them. I think, the records actually sound quite kind of smooth, and most of them are relatively cohesive. But I mean, live they did definitely rock. I'm sure someone was turning up their guitars to 11.
Manzanera as a guitar player, I think, was perfect for Roxy. What he would do was he would be able to bolt on different styles of guitar playing that maybe he was interested in, you know, rock guitar playing, or lovely player of arpeggios as well, which he used to use a lot, you know, certainly in the latter days. And he had a style very much of his own. Now that, you know, as a musician, that's an incredibly difficult thing to create, is your own style of playing. And especially in those days, amongst a plethora of rock guitar players out there, he was pretty well instantly recognisable as a player.
You can sort of hear little influences from George Harrison and other people. I mean, of course, you know, that was the environment that they were working in, but he seemed to find really unusual things to play, which work, which are not just simply strange or experimental. They actually work.
Phil Manzanera was just a good fit in Roxy Music. He'd come in as a replacement for the previous guitarist, Davey O'List, who I think was probably a more talented guitarist at that time, but didn't really seem to fit in Roxy Music in the way that Manzanera did. Manzanera seemed to have an innate understanding of when he needed to work in the engine room of the band and when he needed to step forward and step into the spotlight. He
was not a brilliant player, but he seemed to get sounds out of his amp or his guitar that other people didn't. And also, I think that Roxy Music bounced off each other brilliantly, so they knew how to mix things.
Paul Thompson, for Roxy Music, was the perfect drummer in many ways, because he seemed to understand and move seamlessly from different tempos and different styles. So he was sort of he was connected into the band and played the songs. If a drummer plays the song, they're listening to the lyrics and they're looking at the overall picture. They're not just looking at the flash technique.
It would have been easy to want for somebody playing drums with that band to want to play stranger things, but in fact it was completely right that a lot of the time he played it real rock solid, just simple rock drums.
He had a musical training, unlike the other guys from Roxy who all came from an art school background. Paul Thompson was trained. Whether he was he a stylish drummer? Yeah, I think he had a kind of certain feel. He also whacked his drums very hard, which again, I'm not sure people would associate that with Roxy Music, because you associate that with, you know, drongo rock and roll bands.
Just as he was the guy who drove along those up-tempo songs like Virginia Plain or Editions of You, he was also the guy who produced subtle drumming on tracks like Strictly Confidential or Beauty Queen. So I think he was a guy with a tremendous range, but I think that obviously his real talents were in those up-tempo numbers.
In a way, Paul is the easiest person in Roxy Music to overlook, because there's all this stuff, you know, unusual stuff going on. And most of the time, Paul's just holding things down and laying down the time and the feel. But in fact, there are some moments, for instance, For Your Pleasure, where he gets, you know, because of the nature of the song, he gets to play some quite unusual stuff, and he always rose to the challenge, just like Ringo did in the Beatles.
I don't think any of Roxy Music were virtuoso musicians. I think what they all had was a unique take on their own instruments and their own kind of melodic and stylistic ideas.
As a band, they weren't showing off their musical prowess all the time. It was songs, it was a cohesive chemistry unit of a group of musicians that were actually creating, you know, something for the listener.
From heaven. Is there a heaven? I'd like to think so. Standards of living, they're rising daily, but home, oh sweet home, it's only a saying.
Roxy music are at their best when the source material is that little bit dark, a little bit edgy, and I think that this paean to an inflatable doll is perhaps the ultimate example of this.
Penthouse perfection, but what goes on? What to do then? Better pray then.
It's very, very empty, which is not, and it's very, very empty for a very long time. I mean, the whole main body of the song is basically just organ and voice.
Kind of wheezy organ sound that builds up the tension behind, and the guitar overlays almost seem to drift out into the background as you get drawn into Ferry's vocal and those extraordinary lyrics that seem to build.
I bought you mail-order, my plain wrapper baby. Your skin is like vinyl, the perfect companion.
I think at the time it must have tried people's patience a bit, listening all the way through to see what on earth is going to happen next, and sort of nothing very much happens, but the lyric kind of is starting to go off somewhere that you realise it's not going somewhere sort of very obvious or nice.
And I think it's very much Ferry stretching out into his kind of role, being maybe less self-conscious as a performer and as a writer.
Can't throw you away now. Immortal and life-size.
It goes round and round and round on a minor progression, with a little bit of sax coming in here and there. It's very atmospheric, but it builds and builds and builds over a period of a few minutes, with, I suppose, Brian Ferry, in a sense, telling a story. And it goes round and round, quite hypnotic. Then suddenly, at the end of it, it bursts into this big rock guitar solo, and everybody gets really busy musically, you know, and that it goes off into the distance then.
I blew up your body, but you blew my mind.
Takes such a long time to get there, and I think that's, you know, it was pretty brave, because very easy to lose people, you know, I think.
But it's a very good pointer as to what Roxy music were capable of when they weren't worrying about showing how innovative they were. It's a shame to find out it's about a rubber doll, really, because you kind of want it to be about some ethereal, you know, ghost from a bygone age, but actually it's about a rubber doll from a section.
Well, I'm here looking through an old picture frame, just waiting for the perfect view. I hope something special will step into my life, another fine edition of you. A pin of dirty shades of blue.
Editions of You is similar to Remake, Remodel in the sense that it has a lot of those New York Velvet Underground style again. So this is something they kept visiting again, this style. Not so much throughout their career in later days, but in earlier days they would visit this. This was obviously something they liked playing.
Editions of You has a very distinctive bass part, which actually you could almost mistake it for the Stranglers. You know, it's a very aggressive bass part which, you know, which the song is built on, more or less.
It's actually one of Ferry's cleverest lyrics, although that can be missed, I think, because of the up-tempo nature of the song. Again, he talks about all kinds of diverse things, but it's really a fairly simply structured song, I think. It's a kind of descending chord sequence that repeats again and again.
For something that was a single, I think there are, I forget exactly, but there's 4 or 5 times round the sequence that are instrumental. Everybody gets a bit of a solo. There's a drum fill thing that comes up before, and you know, there's a little bass thing.
You've also got Eno going absolutely bonkers in the middle of it. Again, you know what he does on that track. Loads of artists who would now be operating in the dance music field. You know, they took their career, or they based their career on those few minutes of music.
You could make a very strong case for Your Pleasure being Roxy's best album. It's difficult really, because it's a bit like choosing between your favourite children, but I think that it is a more rounded album than the first one. It seems to sit together better than perhaps some of the others. Again, the source material is very diverse. It's rather audacious again for them to have so many diverse themes within the songs when you think about the track listing.
Do what you will. Who knows what tomorrow might bring? Learn from your mistakes is my only advice. And stay cool and still not make room. Don't play yourself for a fool. Too much.
I mean, a lot of people say that Roxy Music were never the same after Brian Eno left. Now, he left after 2 albums. You know, a lot of people say that they kind of lost their avant-garde edge and just became more Ferry's baby.
When Brian Eno left and Eddie Jobson joined, he joined on the Stranded album. And Eddie played keyboards and played violin, so he was another instrument being introduced into the band. And it's quite interesting, you know, because they didn't try and replace Brian Eno as such. They got somebody else who had his own stamp musically, which is sort of unusual, really, because they were quite established in their sound by then. So once again, they weren't scared to take a risk.
I just think creatively, you know, I'm not quite sure what he did. Might be harsh, Eddie. Sorry, but, you know, you ain't Brian Eno, mate.
I think Eno was about the bigger things, about concepts, if you like, and about shaping the sound, whereas in reality Eddie Jobson was a far superior player.
Eddie Jobson had a very developed classical musical background and was a very kind of accomplished musician in all sorts of ways, both as a violinist, piano player, and arranger and so on. And so I think that was a pretty smart move, because that brought in something that they hadn't really had up to that point, and so expanded the range of possibilities for them, which they then took major advantage of.
Street Life is one of Roxy Music's sort of 3 or 4 most exciting moments. The intro is just incredibly exciting, that kind of, the way it just builds up, and then however long that takes, 20 seconds in, you're just like waiting for this thing, and then it kicks off. You know, it's like being attacked by a lion out of the speakers.
Wish everybody would leave me alone, yeah. They're always calling on my telephone. When I pick it up, there's no one there. So I walk outside just to take the air. Come on with me, cruising down the street. Who knows what you'll see, who you might meet. Oh, this brave new world's not like yesterday. It can take you higher than the Milky Way. Now I'm blinded, I can't really see, yeah. No more bright lights confusing me, no. Don't ask me why I'm feeling
quite a quirky song. Once again, it's got that sort of circular thing that they have where they keep going around a chord progression. But yeah, personally, I quite liked it. I thought that period that it came from, which was the Strand album, was a good period of Roxy music. It was a good single. It was probably the thing to do at that point, is to release something that was accessible to a wider audience.
I think that Street Life is one of Roxy's greatest creations, but somehow it didn't quite work as a single, unfortunately. I'm not sure that everyone really got it. You know, that it really had the kind of mainstream appeal for singles buyers at that time, who brought up on a diet of bubblegum pop. Perhaps it was a bit too clever.
Song for Europe is one of their more interesting songs. There's a lot more chords in it, because sometimes they'd keep things as simple as possible. This one moves around quite a lot musically, and is quite clever as well musically. It's a nice song. A ballad, so it's got sort of different sections to it. So what's going on here is they start with an A minor chord, arpeggiated, and then a G major chord with the third in the root, which is a B. Then it goes to C major, then it goes to D minor, then it goes to E suspended fourth to an E major. So that's the verse pattern.
And here by the Seine, Notre Dame casts a long, lonely shadow. Now only sorrow, no tomorrow. There's no today for us. Nothing is there for us to share, but yes.
The song itself has big themes, I think. I think that the grand, sprawling piano opening is a wonderful way to open the song. And then again, these moments of drama are created by the key changes and by the timing changes within the song.
It's got a sort of Beatlesque, darker Beatles side to it. You know, the Beatles did these sort of dark things like She's So Heavy and that sort of stuff.
Ferry and Andy Mackay, who wrote the song, were trying to create something with the feel of perhaps something like the French songs of the 1960s. I definitely hear a kind of Edith Piaf croon within Ferry's vocal.
These cities may change, but there always remains my obsession.
What's interesting about this is it's got three sections, which of course is this very light section, which is like a Beatles thing, and the suspension every time, so it has a resolve. Then the next section is much bigger, more sort of, you know, rocky, with clever chord changes. You think it's going somewhere and it goes somewhere else, is what's really clever about it. And it's satisfying to the ear, because when you get to the last section before the solo, which is what I would call the orchestral build-up, at the end of each section, although it modulates to a different key, you get a suspended chord, and then the chord actually goes to its major, so you always get a sense of satisfaction. Throughout the whole song, you're continually, as each section finishes, you get satisfied musically with it. So for instance, that last section goes, you know, and here's the suspension to the satisfaction of the major, and the second section, the suspension to the satisfaction of the F. So each time you get this feeling of you've come to rest again musically.
not one of Roxy Music's best-known songs or most played songs. I think it's a bit of a sort of hidden gem on an album that, you know, people maybe don't listen to the Roxy albums as much as people think they do. I think people listen to best-ofs. And I think on the radio you hear, what is it, 3, 4, 5 tracks of Roxy Music. It's constantly being repeated. They're one of those bands. And I think stuff like A Song for Europe, it actually is kind of one of their most interesting moments, but it's kind of been hidden away in a corner somewhere.
Well, I've been up all night. Party time wasting is too much fun. Then I step back thinking of life's inner meaning and my latest fling.
Because For Your Pleasure had been a really big success and really attracted a huge amount of attention at the time, but perhaps Stranded didn't attract quite as much attention, so was perceived to be, you know, not as much, you know, not as good in some way. But I certainly don't think of it as being a sort of, you know, a downturn or anything. No.
Oh, mother of God, I would trade you for another girl.
Commercially, it was Roxy Music's first UK #1 album, and critically, it reached the #1 position during the Christmas market, so it was a very big seller for Roxy, so I think it was a commercial success. Artistically, it was something of a transitional album, I think.
It may not have been as forward-looking as the first 2 Roxy Music albums, which I think is probably the criticism some people would level at it.
When they came along with such a burst, and it was so different that to keep and continually, you know, have new ideas and keep coming up with something that was completely off the wall was extremely difficult.
Gets you down. But the search for perfection, your own predilection, goes on and on and on and on.
Roxy were the first band that had an innate understanding that all of their output, however they were perceived by the public, was all important. The way that their music was constructed, the way that their look was, right down to the detail on their album covers.
These are the coolest album covers you've ever seen in your life. My God, did you want to know these women? You were never going to get to know these women. You knew Brian Ferry, knew all of them intimately.
At the time, there was quite a sort of down-to-earth approach to things like artwork, albums and so on, and a lot of rock music was all about not being in the least bit glitzy or showbiz, and so the whole Roxy reaction thing, which kicked off the glam rock sort of thing, was just, again, it was really noticeable just because it wasn't what people were doing. So having these incredibly glamorous women, or glamorous images like, you know, with Brian and his tux and the limo and the city lights behind him and stuff, that was so against the general sort of thing that was going on at the time.
Never has a cover or a series of covers been designed that gave you a better indication of the sexy sophistication, or that mix of sophistication and pure sex that was contained within these albums.
Well, I like the girls. And yeah, I mean, I think it, you know, although they were posed obviously and they were all sort of put together, there was quite a lot of thought went into them. And I think rather like their image, you know, from, you know, when they were on stage and when they were in photo shoots and all that sort of stuff. And I'm sure even when they were on the street to a certain extent, they walked around like that because they wore Roxy Music on their, you know, their sleeve.
Of course, perhaps Roxy's most remembered album cover was that for Country Life, their 4th album, which received a ban in the United States and in other places throughout the world, and quite often appeared in bowdlerized form with just the heads of the models. Of course, I think it was an intention to shock. and I think it achieved that effect very well indeed.
Don't want to know about anything, 'cause all I want is you. Going out with other girls was always such a bore, but since I fell in love with you, I need you more and more.
All I Want Is You, I don't think it represents a loss of musical edge. I think lyrically it's a little bit straighter and it's a little bit more about an obvious kind of boy-girl situation, which most of their songs had not been up to that point. But no, I mean, to me that kind of carries on from Virginia Plain and Street Life and Editions of You and stuff. Musically, I mean, but yeah, lyrically, it's a little bit softer, I guess.
This was another attempt to write a single. You know, it didn't necessarily sit well with the more innovative or avant-garde stuff that they were producing on the album, but I think it's such a strong single that it's got qualities of its own.
It's just Brian Ferry being cool and suave and sophisticated and doing his James Bond at the microphone impression again. I think it's lovely.
I could see them sitting around saying, well, that was good, it's not going to sort of change the world, but it's a good song and we'll do it. You know, most bands have tracks like that, and you have to have light and shade. You know, every song cannot sort of pin you to the wall.
Don't want to learn about etiquette from glossy magazines. Why should I try to talk correct like they do in magazines? All I will say no more, roll out inventory. Just starting to all I want, just make enough all I want, man. All I want, 'cause I contribute.
Brian Ferry was ultimately a romantic. You know, he was a romantic who I think probably listened to a lot of Fred Astaire and Bing Crosby and those kind of, just amazing crooners, and that's where his style came from.
We have the luxury now that we can essentially cherry pick from the catalogue as to what we play live now. So yeah, I mean, I'd say all the stuff that we play now definitely holds up. I think if you go through all of the albums, you'll find a few things that you might not really want to do live now. But actually, I think it's remarkable actually how little chaff there is amongst the wheat with that run of Roxy albums.
The sky is dark, the wind is cold, the night is young before it's old and gray. We will
The Thrill of It All is a song that we still open the show with very often, and it's again like Remake, Remodel. It's a blast of energy. It's it's a riff song. You blast into it. It's got a big chant in it where everyone goes whoa, and then all this stuff.
It's an old live highlight, I think, this particularly driven along by Paul Thompson's thumping drums.
It had 4 crotchets on the snare as opposed to the second and the fourth in the bar, so you get every beat was being played. Pushed the thing along. It had a great bass line, had sort of loads of rock guitar, and the middle section sort of went into this sort of late 60s, maybe Bowie-esque sort of style of song as well. But once again, it's typical of Roxy because you'd get to a middle section, most people would write a chord progression that worked with the bit before, but not Roxy. They thought, okay, let's go to this different place. And they could pull it off because they meant it.
You might as well know what is right for you. And make the most of what you like to do.
The thrill of it all sounds incredibly menacing. Ferry almost sounds like David Bowie at times, which is a pretty unusual thing to say. You know, he never sounded like anyone apart from Brian Ferry, but he really does sound very Bowie-esque at times on that track. You know, again, I think it is one of their wildest songs.
Oh, here it comes, that old ennui. I hope it won't stay long. Well, it's every man do his own thing, and every singer to his song.
You knew that when you got a Roxy Music record, it was going to have a great cover, and when you delved into it, we'd have interesting lyrics, you know, interesting pieces of music. Experiment.
Their clothes certainly haven't stood the test of time. The stuff they wore in the first couple of albums, I think they look embarrassing, and I think they now find it all quite cringeworthy. But the actual music itself just transcended all of that.
Anyone who's seeking to experiment and find unusual combinations is not going to succeed every time. You know, and so I think there are moments in the Roxy catalogue where you have to say that's not really working that great, but surprisingly few occasions actually. I guess they must have been pretty good at self-editing. Somewhere in the archives maybe there's loads of absolute drivel, I don't know.
In many ways, it was a band. You know how bands are put together nowadays. You couldn't put a band together like that nowadays. It just wouldn't happen. It was a chemistry of people that came together at the right moment, at the right time, with the same thought process.
They were always searching for unusual, non-obvious ways of putting music together, putting rock music together, which is hard because it's a fairly limiting medium.
Rock and roll was meant to be an ephemeral sport. No one really considered that you'd be listening to the same music 30 years down the line. Now, we're probably not all listening to Mud and Sweet albums, you know, but I'm still listening to Roxy Music albums all the time.
Well, I myself, my main concern is what I can afford. So if music be my mistress, then at least she's Madam